Welcome to today's lecturette, our final lecturette actually in this unit of study. I'm Leslie Jones, and today we're going to be extending our conversation around looking at macro system public policies. In our last lecturette, we explored what were some of the conditions that make for effective public policy, and in today's lecturette, we're going to be taking a review of some of those public policies that have a specific focus on supporting children and those that have a specific focus on supporting families, and really look at what has been the overall impact of those effective public policies. Throughout this unit, we've discussed broadly the impact that public policy can have. In our last lecturette, we discussed the elements of public policy that assist to make it really effective. Effective or not, the cascade effect of public policy is a persistent and pervasive influence to both the exo and micro systems. It shapes the way in which professionals engage with children and families, identifies minimum standards for professional practice and service provision through regulations, standards, and funding envelopes. As we review policies, we can also see that each has a specific focus or objective. Some of the policies that we have discussed throughout this unit have had a clear focus on children, and while others have had a focus on families. We have spoken in our last lecturette and in others about the interconnected ways in which public policy is enacted in local communities. And in fact, the integration of services is an emerging best practice model for collective impact. However, it is also really helpful to review examples of separate focus in public policy to really better understand the mechanisms of policy development, and in doing so, the potential complexity that emerges when integration of services requires communities and government agencies to consider how to develop integrated service models where multiple policy frameworks are in play together. To begin with, I'd like to take a look at the public policies that have had a direct impact on professional practice. Since 2009 and the gazetting through COAG of the National Reform Agenda, the Early Childhood Education and Care sector, or the ECEC sector, has negotiated a range of public policy changes, including the new National Quality Framework. The framework examines a range of elements that influence the early years, including the things such as educator qualifications, child-staff ratios, and the development of new national laws and regulations that set out a minimum compliance requirements at a national level for the very first time. The reform agenda also saw the development of the National Quality Standards as a quality assurance policy and the Early Years Learning Framework as a policy initiative to guide a universal approach to professional practice across the sector. The impact of this cluster of public policies has been profound in the early years sector in Australia. It has seen the first national agenda to unify practice, quality standards and regulations. Since the implementation of 2012, there has been a consistent improvement in quality ratings, and while we may recognise that these can be subjective and as only a beginning point on our journey around understanding quality, it is still undoubtedly evidence of the influence and impact of this type of public policy. This degree of uniformity has had the impact of providing some sense of comfort to families of the standards and practices that they should expect to see in their local services, and to the school a sense of comfort that there is a beginning of professional alignment between the two sectors. It has without question changed the professional profile of our sector. In 7 short years, the ECEC sector has moved from more than half of the sector's educators being unqualified to 100% being qualified with at least a minimum of a Certificate 3, and half of those people with a required minimum standard of a diploma. And of course, for each long day care centre to have a minimum of 1 bachelor qualified teacher on staff. I wanted to also take a moment to look a little bit deeper into the implementation of national law and regulations, remembering that before 2012, there was no national approach to law and regulations governing the ECEC sector. Each state had its own set of legislative instruments and regulations. So for the first time in 2012, there was a unifying approach to regulations and legislative instruments to govern the sector. And so the national law provides a jointly governed, uniform national approach to the regulations and quality assessments of education and care services. The national law was developed cooperatively by the Australian governments and states and territories through the process of nationally applied law legislation. And therefore, the Education and Care Services National Law 2010 was passed and came into effect. The national law and regulations are administered by state regulators and their authorised officers. Centres are assessed for compliance before a service approval to operate is granted. And authorised officers also visit at centres to conduct spot visits to check compliance to national law and or to respond to complaints raised about the service. And the authorised officers are also the people that visit services to do the assessment and rating processes under the quality framework and the national quality standards. And so, with the implementation of national law and national regulations, the impact to the sector has been an increased consistency in the way in which services operate and in which they are assessed and regulated, and has removed some of the disparity that we were seeing between jurisdictions and states. And in so doing, actually provides greater sense of consistency and predictability in the service provision in all early learning services, whether they'd be family daycare, long day care, or sessional preschools. A significant public policy that impacts on the EC sector is, of course, the National Quality Standards. Implemented in 2012, the National Quality Standards replaced the former National Accreditation System and became mandated for all EC services regardless of operational model. So National Quality Standards applies to long day care, family day care, outside school hours care, and sessional preschools and kindergartens. The 7 quality areas and 40 elements within those quality areas provides a roadmap of quality markers that are assessed by state-based authorised officers at regular intervals, anywhere between 1 to 3 years between visits, depending on the rating that services actually achieve. The ratings under the NQS include a rating of significant improvement required, a working towards, meeting the standards and then exceeding the standards. And there is a final rating of excellent that is a rating that centres apply for separately, and they must have received an exceeding rating in all 7 areas to be eligible to apply for an excellent rating. Recent refinements to the system have seen this emerging themes around centres who are aiming to receive an exceeding rating. And the themes include that they have to have embedded practice in the service operation, and that practice is informed by critical reflection, and that practice is shaped by meaningful engagement with families and or the community. The impact of this public policy has been a slow and steady increase in the levels of ratings that services are achieving. That has been very promising across all operational models. And the long day care sector, as we've discussed before, has shown significant improvement and is now sitting in the high 97 percentile of all services assessed meeting or exceeding the national quality standards. So the impact has been this slow and steady increase in ratings, but that also is evidence of a growing understanding of what constitutes our notion of quality at this point in time and how we actually go about achieving that. The impact around those quality markers is that national focus, so that we're seeing services have a shared language and a shared understanding of what we're all talking about when we talk about quality practices and quality environments and quality approaches to working with families and children and communities. And of course, the impact for families have been that they are also becoming much more aware of what the national quality standards mean and what they can actually expect when they have their child attend an early learning service. So those 2 impacts are really quite profound and powerful in how we have a shared understanding of what both government, professionals and families are looking for in terms of service provision for young children. And the final pillar of public policy that has impacted on the ECEC sector is, of course, that of the early years learning framework, including the principles, practices and learning outcomes that form the belonging, being and becoming aspects of the EYLF. Gazetted in 2009 and implemented in 2012, it represents the first national learning framework for early learning services and captures, again, all the operating models across Australia, including long day care, family day care, outside school hours care, and sessional preschools and kindergartens. And it encompasses the principles and practices and learning outcomes that guide professional practice in our sector. And it's really important to recognise that before 2012, there was no national document that guided the professional practices of services. Each service provider relied on the skills, expertise, and individual values and beliefs of their educators to develop early learning programs for their children. As such, the EYLF was a public policy that broke new ground for the sector, for children and for families. And the impact of that, again, similar to the national quality standards, has been to provide a consistent, unifying view of what are the principles, practices, and learning outcomes that we should expect to see in our early learning services. The overarching impact of the cluster of policies under the National Quality Reform Agenda has actually been to establish consistency across the country, a shared language, and a shared understanding of what good looks like. And in so doing has really been the enabling policies to help with the professionalisation of the early years sector. It's a positive step forward and aligns with the international movement for the professionalisation of those working with very young children in the prior to school sector. I'd now like to take a look at some of the macro system public policies that have been specifically designed to support families. There are a diverse range of public policies specifically designed to support families, and we've discussed these during the unit and as we've explored specific aspects of child and family contexts. But some of these policies include the policies such as the CCS and the additional CCS for children with additional needs that came into effect in 2017. CCS was designed, or childcare subsidy was designed to make childcare more affordable for families and to stimulate workforce participation. And the impact that we're seeing coming through the data suggests that about 80% of families under this new policy regime are really financially better off. Criticisms of this policy still exist for its things such as the activity tests that we've spoken about and the reduction of access for families who do not meet the activity test to 12 hours. It's also important to recognise that CCS was also designed to simplify the system for both government and families, and it saw the combining together of two previous policy funding policies, that of childcare benefit and childcare rebate. These former funding policies were confusing and clunky for families and service operators alike. So CCS has combined both and increased the overall funding envelope of around about $2.4 billion over the implementation phase. Another significant public policy that impacts families is that of family tax benefit. FTB is a payment that helps eligible families with the cost of raising children, and there's two parts to it. So Family Tax Benefit Part A is paid per child, and the amount that gets paid per child is based on the family's overall circumstances. Family Tax Benefit Part B is paid per family and gives extra help to single parents and some couples where families have only one main income. And of course, another public policy that impacts families and supports families is that of the Australian Government's paid parental leave system. Eligible employees who are the primary carer of a newborn infant or an adopted child get up to 18 weeks leave paid at the national minimum wages. And another bracket of public policies that we've spoken quite extensively about in this unit are those examples of target policies initiatives such as the Parents Under Pressure program or the PUP program and Triple P and things like Communities for Children, and then the Logan Together initiative that we used as an example in one of our earlier lectures. The policies to develop and fund these programs has had a focus on providing targeted support to parents experiencing significant specific challenge. Such policies enable agencies with requisite expertise to develop the on-the-ground responses where they are needed most. There are a multitude of these types of community programs that operate in each state. Some are a national approach, such as Communities for Children, and while others are a state or regional response. The impact of all of these types of policies have been to afford families the financial support and access to expertise to ensure that family functioning is supported and that parents can refine their approach to support their children in more effective ways. It provides mechanisms by which young parents can rewrite their own family scripts to be better, and provides a strong recognition that better functioning families is not only good for children, but good for our communities and ultimately good for our country. It is important that wherever you may be working, that you research what programs are available for families, both targeted and financial support and universal programs that we've spoken about, so that you as a professional can play your part on having a positive influence and impact for families. Now turning to the macro system public policies that have been specifically designed to support children. Child protection, mandatory reporting legislation, out of home care legislation, and the National Principles for Child Safe Organisation and the National Framework for Protecting Children are all examples of public policy and legislation specifically focused on children. Policy focus on children addresses many of the obligations that we have signed up for under the provision, protection and participation elements of the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child. And we've discussed the UNCRC at length in earlier lecturettes. Other public policies, beyond those directly focused around child protection, include legislations in such areas as Education Acts, Universal Access Policy for all 4-year-old children to access an early learning program delivered by a qualified teacher, family law, including custody arrangements for older children, and where they have a real say in those proceedings, and of course to anti-discrimination legislation, supporting children's rights to participate in education without stigma or separation from their peers. These public policies and legislation instruments also meet the provision and participation requirements under our obligations of the United Nations Conventions of the Rights of the Child. And so the impact of these types of public policies has been really quite profound in recent decades for the children of Australia. We see children participating in things that they historically have not participated in, and very recently and very a contemporary issue for Australia, we're seeing a much greater public focus on the rights of children to be protected from child abuse and harm. And it's a real maturation of our society that we can have difficult conversations around the lived experiences of children and the lack of protection that they have been afforded by institutions and by individual people. And recognising that children have a growing place in our government and in our communities and in our societies is a real impact and is representative of the aims and focuses of these types of public policies. The policies that we have discussed here today and throughout this unit of study represent the best intentions of planning by government and communities. But public policy is only as good as those who are implementing it. It is the enactment of these policies where real impact is affected. They guide the interactions we have with children in their microsystems through proximal processes. Public policy is enacted through the exo and microsystems through the relationships and proximal processes that you engage with on an everyday basis. The children, families and communities' lived experience of public policy as an enabling support or a constraining influence in no small way is influenced by the people on the ground. The teachers, the caseworkers, the lawyers, the departmental personnel, ancillary health professionals, community agents, local government workers, and at some point you. The knowledge, experience, values and beliefs and a willingness to understand the complexity of working with children and families is a career-long challenge and an infinitely rewarding one. As a final note, I'd like to share with you a story from an educator that I was working with many years ago. We'd been working through much the same content as I shared with you during this unit of study, and I commented to her that I had observed that she was always really upbeat and so engaging with children and families. She never brushed off comments, she never looked too busy, and she always had an ear to listen. She looked at me and she said, "Well, I don't think I can afford not to be like that. How do I know that I'm not the only person today that has said hello or smiled or taken the 1 minute to genuinely ask how they are?" She also made the comment that she viewed every day as an opportunity to make wonderful memories for her children and her families. Her comment has actually stayed with me for more than 20 years. The children you work with may never remember your name as they grow up. However, don't ever underestimate the influence and impact that you can have on their development and well-being for both children and parents. The proximal processes that you engage with the everyday working with children is just so critical. What you do and how you do it will define who you are in the lives of children and families and colleagues. Make your impact count in the right ways. I'm so excited for you to begin your career working with children and families in your local communities. It is sometimes challenging and tiring work. It is never dull, and I hope that you build wonderful memories of the children, families, and colleagues that you will encounter during your career. Thank you so much for joining me for this unit of study, and I wish you all the very best of luck.